I saw the documentary. I thought it was amazing. I didn't know much about the Negro League outside of the mention of it when speaking of like Jackie Robinson. So I do have to say I learned quite a bit. And you're a world-renowned, well-known documentary director. How do you decide what projects and what made you do this project specifically?
Well, I'm always interested in doing something about the African American experience, historically. And in this particular case, one of the producers, Byron Motley, whose dad, Bob Motley, had been a Negro League umpire in the 40s and the 50s, reached out to me over 10 years ago about directing a documentary about his dad and about the Negro Leagues. And I knew a little bit about the Negro Leagues growing up. I knew about specifically about Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson. You know, I didn't know all these stories about there were different iterations of the Negro League. So when he reached out to me, I was excited. I was curious. I said, okay, let's jump into it. And like a lot of documentary, it took a certain amount of time to raise the money and get people attracted to it. And we were fortunate that Questlove got excited and wanted to come on as an executive producer. And then we reached out to a company called Radical Media, who Quest was working with on Summer of Soul, and they were excited about it. And that started the wheels rolling to really, about 2.5 years ago, to get things in a pre-production stage, to bring a researcher on, to find people that we were going to interview, to put together a team of producers and cinematographers and editors to tell this story. So, it's always a little bit of a long haul, but if you're committed, you hang in.
Okay, now, so Andrew Rube Foster.
Yeah.
It's so crazy that I've actually, unfortunately, never heard of him. And he was so influential, not just to the Negro League, but to baseball, like finding out that he created the screwball. Why is it, or what did you learn, or if you know, or just an opinion as to why a lot of the contributions that were made to baseball as a whole are largely forgotten?
Sharifa, we live in America, and like I know, American history has been written by those who are in control. And what do they do when they tell the history of America when they're in control? They minimize the contributions of people of color. And you and I have seen this. You're much younger than me, but you understand it, and it's been happening time and time again. So there was no reason for them in the history books to make a point that it was Rube Foster who taught the screwball to Christy Mathewson. There was no reason to say that the tempo of Major League Baseball, the notion of bunt and steal and running bases, basically came out of the way Negro League players played. And they brought that kind of energy, and purpose to the game, and they integrated. There's no reason to say to people that the greatest home run hitter, was not Babe Ruth and after 1970s, but Mr. Hank Aaron. This is how the history's taught. I mean, and you see it now. I mean, listen, we got people like Governor Ron DeSantis basically saying, why are we adding all this stuff about, why are you making white people feel guilty? Right. It's not about making white people feel guilty. It's about white people understanding that there's a certain thing in America called systemic racism, that has been part and parcel of the evolution of America, So anytime our stories are put front and center, people say, what? You mean you're not going to talk about the fact that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves? Oh, yeah, he did, but there was a catch to it. So, we live in a country where people don't want to admit that this country was built on enslaved people and the destruction of Native people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. And so there were so many versions of the Negro League. There were so many moments in which the baseball was integrated, and when they often stop allowing us to play.
Yeah.
And then the destruction of the Negro League was when they actually integrated baseball and they took some of the best players that the Negro League had.
Right.
Do you think that was a good or a bad thing? Like, I know integrating baseball was a great thing now, but, you know, with the Negro League unfortunately being disbanded because of it, do you think overall was a good idea?
Well, here's my answer. It's always been a double-edged sword, this notion of segregation and integration in America. You see this now. I mean, you go into Black communities that were primarily Black communities for many, many years, right? And all of a sudden, what's the word that becomes very popular in the 90s and the 80s? Gentrification, right?
Yeah.
You know, white people come into these communities. Why? Because it's cheaper to buy, you know, they can afford it. What happens to Black people who had places in those communities, they get displaced, you know? So this challenge we have in America, this double-edged sword. So here we are in the communities in the 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s that were segregated because white people said, you are second-class citizens. We don't want you in our white neighborhoods. So our doctors and our lawyers and our teachers, they lived in the same community with the other working class Black people. Now, Dr. King, who we all love, you know, and Roy Wilkins and all the other great Black, you know, civil rights advocates, they pushed to no longer have us be second-class citizens, which what did that mean by the 60s when the Civil Rights Act laws were passed? That Black people in certain communities could now, and if you could afford it, you could move out of your community. You could move into a white community or a community where you had once been told you couldn't live. So what happens? Our doctors, our lawyers, our teachers, they leave these self-contained, segregated communities. It's a double-edged sword, you know? So what happens to those communities? Like what happened to the Negro Leagues? When all those Negro League players, many of those Negro League players are invited into the major leagues, what happens to the Negro League teams? They start to lose some of their best players. They start to lose their audience because the audience was not going to see a Jackie Robinson in Brooklyn or seeing Hank Aaron in Milwaukee or seeing Ernie Banks with the Chicago Cubs. So those teams began to suffer as the owners couldn't make any money. It's a double-edged sword. So, you know, integration is good on one level, as we say in the film, but there's the downside to it, always.
Yeah. Yeah. Now we're talking a lot about race, so this will hopefully be the last race question.
No, it's always should be about race. Keep talking about it.
Well, Effa Manley, in the documentary, it was stated that, you know, they didn't know if she was white, Black, as in passing. Does it matter based on everything that she does what her race was, or whether we find out what her race is?
Well, my take, it doesn't matter. Because why? Because no matter what her race was, she saw herself as a person of color who was there to support the people in her community. I mean, just the Bloomstein story alone says a tremendous amount about this lady. Here she goes and challenges the owners of Bloomstein and say, how come you don't have any Black women working in your store? The store is based on 125th Street. I grew up going to that store, you know, in the 60s. Yeah, because it was around in the 60s. And she's saying, you don't have any Black women in their store, you need to hire some Black women. And she basically guilt trips them into hiring Black women, you know, and then she's co-owner of a team that wins the 1946 World Series. So if she wasn't a Black person, she sure basically toed the line.
Now, so one thing that my take over the documentary as I watched and I learned was that what we did with baseball when it was Black, when the Negro League and we had the Black World Series, we made it more of an entertaining sport, you know, when we added all of our talent in it. And I mean, honestly, when it comes to any sport, we make it a lot more entertaining.
You see, look at basketball, look at football. You know, basketball was a game with, you know, a lot of white guys played. It was a very flat game in the 30s and the 40s. And in the 50s, all of a sudden, you know, when Bill Russell, then Will Chamberlain, Elgin Baylor, and, you know, I just finished a documentary about Bill Russell called The League. I mean, called The Legend.
No, The Legend, yes.
And Nelson George says in that film, he says, when Black players came into the game, they brought the Black athletic, you know, perspective to the game.
Yeah.
And the same thing happened in baseball. You know, they brought different energy. They brought a little more panache and excitement and fun to the game. You're right. It happens every time. Happens with the culture. It happens with the music, hip hop. It
Yeah,
happens with the clothing. It
yeah.
happens with the language. Sometimes you hear, I don't want to be like, too cynical, but sometimes you hear white people talking and they've got the argot that they learned from us.
Yes. Well, I always say we speak with a cadence. Like we're very poetic with
Sure.
everything, you know. And so speaking of the Negro League and everything, for me, it kind of feels like I don't really see as many Black players. And I'm not a huge baseball fan. I learned and watched through my siblings. So my brother teaches me and shows me things, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of Black players.
Well, it's changed. I mean, between the 50s and 60s and 70s, there were lots of Black players.
Right.
As you get to the 80s and 90s, there were less Black players and more Latino players playing the game. And why was that? Because baseball, for a lot of young people, particularly in our communities, became too slow. Everybody got attracted to, you can see this. You go out to the courts, there were basketball courts. There wasn't baseball you could play, it was basketball. So basketball became the number one, baseball used to be the number one American pastime. No longer is basketball, as far as I'm concerned, or football, and because young Black people got attracted to basketball and football, so baseball, there aren't as many Black players in the game today as there was 20, 30 years ago.
But do you think if they saw more or they knew more of the history that might change?
That might, yeah. And then it's also about the communities, unique communities that's going to introduce more Little League to the teams, to the communities, Little League players. And usually Little League is a game that's played more in suburban communities, not so much in urban communities. So, that's the big challenge, to have these urban communities, engage in more Little League sort of initiation into baseball. Because listen, the reason that baseball's changed their rules this season is because they're trying to get more people to come to the game and watch them, get the games more exciting. I took my daughters when they were in their teens to a baseball game to see the New York Yankees. And that game lasted maybe 3 hours. Now, I love baseball, but I grew up in a house where my dad was a huge baseball fan. And my oldest son's a baseball fan. But my daughters, I'm telling you, they hated it. They said, Dad, this game is like slow and boring. Now, for me, I love the tempo, but they hated it. And that's how most people are about it, because we live in a world like this now.
Yeah. Microwave.
That's right, a microwave world.
Well, the thing is, I've been to one baseball game, and I ended up leaving early because it was very long. But I learned that they've shortened it, and they put sort of like in basketball where they put the a timer to speed it up.
Clock. They got a pitch clock now. You got to be able to pitch that ball. You can't stay out of the batter's box too long anymore.
Yeah. So. But also, I don't know, I feel like when we talk about the history of other sports, we have all of these Black legends that we can quote and we can talk about. And I just feel like when we only kind of there's maybe 3 or 4 that I hear on a rotating basis when it comes to baseball. And I don't know, I think with this documentary, more people will learn and be more interested. But I don't know, I feel like that plays somewhat of a part in why it's not as, and of course, the whole urban and baseballs and suburbia, I get that, but I also feel like a lot has to do with not being able to see or know our history. It affects our present and future.
Sure, it always does. The challenge we always face is that people don't have much interest in history, learning about the past, And to me, I've always been excited about learning about history. Learning about the African-American experience or the African experience, but people need to be engaged. And how does that happen? It really happens in the schools. You need to have schools teaching you about this history. Or I was fortunate, I was part of some organizations where they were indoctrinating me in the history. I remember I was at an organization and one of the day the guy put on Malcolm X's The Ballad of the Bullet. A recording of Malcolm's speeches. And I thought, whoa, who's this Malcolm X? So
And
I
you were
was
young.
learning, and I was, yeah, 13, 14 years old. I was
Wow.
learning the history. I was
Yeah.
learning about our history. I was learning, someone introduced me to Marcus Garvey. I said, oh, Marcus Garvey, I learned about, you learned. I mean, the one thing about it, when you were in segregated communities, you learned our history. You learned about Booker T. Washington. You learned about Du Bois. You learned that stuff. And young people, you ask somebody about Booker T. Washington today, say, Booker who?
Yeah. Now, of course,
Yeah.
well, it's weird. It seems like Black history is a luxury for Black people to learn, because if you don't come from a household, it's not taught in our schools. So if you don't come from a household that teaches you it as you grow up,
You don't learn
but
it.
yeah. So, it's great for, like, that's why I love, especially documentaries about Black history, because entertainment is where we learn a lot of the
That's
times
right.
for Black people. So final, this was great. I appreciate it. I felt like it was very informative, and you are very passionate about us. I appreciate that tremendously. What's something that you really hope anyone who watches it takes away, outside of just learning? Because I think it's such a good lesson.
Well, this is what always I hope with these films I make, that you realize and learn that our history is so rich, so engaging, so complicated, and that is a really part of if you want to talk about being an American, you got to know our history too. You know, I grew up at a time where the history I was supposed to learn was George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. These were three great presidents. I didn't know anything else. It took me a while before I learned about A. Philip Randolph. Learned about Mary McLeod Bethune, or learned about Ralph Ellison, or Zora Neale Hurston, or Langston Hughes. I mean, I was in my teens when I started to learn all that stuff. You know, and as a parent, those things are the things I passed on to my children, to know about Zora Neale, to learn to read Langston, to know about Du Bois or Marcus Garvey. So you come away knowing that it wasn't just one side of history, because Americans are so, brainwashed to think that there's only one way to look at America, and there is not.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I really appreciated the documentary, like, tremendously.